Hey everybody, this is Restaurant Gamecore. Now this little mini PC should look pretty familiar. This one is called the UM580, and just about a month ago I reviewed a very similar product called the UM560. Now the case on these are exactly the same, really the only big difference here is the different CPU. And if you remember from my UM560 review, I really liked it. I thought that at the $500 price point it was a great deal. But I also mentioned that the UM580 was on its way and it was only going to be $50 more, and it looked like it was going to be a lot better too. Well, I love it when a plan comes together because the UM580 is here, and I gotta say, this thing exceeded my expectations when it came to this price point. And so let's just dive right in. Okay, so here we are on the MinisForum website. You can see here the UM560 had the 5625U, 16 gigs of RAM, and 512 gigs of storage, and it retails for $499. In fact, you can find it on Amazon for about $480 right now. Now the UM580 has the 5800H CPU, and it's only $50 more. And if you happen to have some RAM or M.2 storage laying around, you could save even more money with the bare bones version. Either way, we're going to think of this like a $550 machine because that's the one I'm testing. So the specs are all listed on the MinisForum website, and you can see them right here. One thing to note here, the 5800H has 8 cores and 16 threads, and it comes with a 100-watt charger. Additionally, it has all those features I would hope for in a mini PC, things like Wi-Fi 6, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, and it also has 4 different ways of giving display out. 2 by HDMI and 2 by USB-C. Now the one that we're testing here is a prototype review unit sent over by MinisForum. As always, all opinions are my own and they are not seeing this video before I publish it. Inside you'll get your typical stuff like an instruction manual to show you the different use cases. We also have a USB-C cable that can be used for both power as well as video if you have a downstream capable monitor. And then we also have a vertical stand. I also appreciate that they added extra rubber feet because you do have to take these off in order to get inside. There's also a 2.5-inch drive connector here as well. Here's a look at the 100-watt power brick that comes with the device. We'll talk about this more in a minute, but I'm really happy with how compact this little thing is. It makes the whole device so much more portable. Also included is a VESA mount if you wanted to mount this to the back of a monitor. And that's really about it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the device itself. We already got a glimpse in the intro, but let's go over the I/O. On the left we have a reset CMOS button, and then the power button, a microphone headphone jack, and then 2 full functioning USB-C ports. The one on the right is also video capable. The UM580 also has a bunch of different air vents here to keep it nice and cool. And so now let's look at the back I/O. First and foremost, on the left here is the alt mode USB-C port. And so this port can be used in 2 ways. One could be just plugging it directly into the power brick like you can see here. One thing to note is that even though the power brick may have multiple ports in it, it's recommended to only use the top one and don't plug anything else in at the same time. I think that's to make sure that 100 watts of solid power is making it to the mini PC. Now the real interesting thing here is that if you have a monitor that is alt mode capable, you'll be able to plug this in using only one cord. The monitor will supply the power to the mini PC, and then the mini PC will also supply the video to the monitor. Unfortunately, my monitor is not capable of powering this device, so I can't really show that off here in real time. But one note of caution here is that the recommended power delivery is going to be about 100 watts, and there are very few monitors that are capable of going up that high. Typically, these monitors will give you about 65 watts of power, which should work okay with using this mini PC in just everyday tasks, but if you were to stress the power draw on this, it would probably crash the machine. So yes, this thing can totally do alt mode, but make sure you have a monitor that is capable of powering it. Anyway, moving on, here's the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. And then we have 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. Next we have 2 HDMI outputs, both capable of 4K and 60 frames, and then 2 USB 2.0 ports. On the bottom here we have the VESA mount holes as you can see in the center, and then these rubber feet as you can see here are covering up these screw holes to get into the device. So let's go ahead and do that now. These rubber feet are held in place using an adhesive, and so this is why I kind of appreciate that they have extra rubber feet, because the more you take these apart, the less the adhesive's going to work. The PC has a little slot right here on the bottom side so you can take a screwdriver or maybe a plastic sponger and just prop it right open. It is super simple to get this apart. So let's take a look at the components. We'll start with the RAM. This is made by Kingston and it is rated at 3200 megahertz. Obviously dual channel with 2 8 gig sticks. And the M.2 solid state drive is 512 gigs and the brand is Ryzen. The Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip is underneath the M.2 solid state drive, and it is MediaTek and also is Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. Now there is a space for a 2.5-inch drive, so I'm going to use this 1 TB solid state drive right here, already loaded up with Batocera. Now it has these two little prongs, which I recently learned are there to hold the hard drive into place. From there, you can just use 2 different screws on the other side to secure it into place. And so yeah, there it is, pretty handy. Now we can use that connector that came in the box to connect the hard drive to the motherboard. And this is all pretty simple, it's just kind of snap into place. And that's really it, so let's go ahead and close this back up, and we've now installed an extra hard drive on the device in like a minute. So yeah, I really love the look and feel of this thing, it's just super compact. In terms of weight with the hard drive, it is 651 grams, or about 1.5 pounds. In terms of sizing, you can see it's about the size of an Xbox controller, or for those who are more dairy-minded, it is about the size of 2 blocks of Kerrygold butter. And so here's what it looks like on a typical desk kind of setup. I really like the look of it. I think the fact that it's mostly black just kind of makes it like a little bit out of sight and out of mind. And it also runs very quietly as well. I think if anything, it would do really well on the back of a monitor. You wouldn't even notice it was there. So turning it on here, let's go ahead and take a look at the specs. And it has the chip we were expecting, 16 gigs of RAM, and it's also running Windows 11 Pro. Looking at the hard drive, we see that it is about 512 gigs, so all good. Now I'm mostly going to focus on gaming with this video in particular, but I do want to just mention that it is going to do well with non-gaming tasks. One of my favorite things to test is how it does when it comes to video editing. So I'm going to take one of my more recent videos and I'm going to chop it up a bunch and then move all those parts together to make a 1-minute clip. From there, I'll add some graphics and transitions, and then we'll export it using 1080p 60 frames per second. And as you can see here, it takes about 46 seconds to do a 1-minute clip. So this thing is going to be great for 1080p video editing and maybe some light 4K editing too. Now speaking of 4K, let's do a little bit of video playback too, in case you wanted to use this as, say, for example, a media server or a home theater media PC. And when I first started out the video, it dropped a few frames, about 32 right there in the beginning as it was getting spun up, but from then on it rendered thousands of frames without dropping a beat. So I think this thing's going to be excellent for media, be that video editing or video encoding or video playback. But honestly, I was expecting that at this price point, so let's move on to gaming and really push it to its limits. We're going to start with PC gaming. I'll do 1080p when I can and drop it down to 720p when needed. And honestly, we're just going to jump into some of the heavy-hitting stuff first and work our way up from there. Ori and the Will of the Wisps, as you can see here, 1080p with balanced or medium settings. It's running just fine, 60 frames per second solid. I did a little bit of Counter-Strike Go playing against some bots, and on the top right you can see it gets well over 100 frames per second. So I would recommend looking at the frames per second and not my terrible gameplay, especially not the fact that I died to a bunch of bots. Anyway, this should be pretty good for competitive shooters. Let's move on. For Skyrim Special Edition, this one did okay at 1080p but did not get a full 60 frames all the time. Now dropping this down to 720p was just fine, and so I think this will be up to you whether or not you want to have the higher graphical fidelity or the smoother gameplay. Either way, I would say Skyrim is totally playable. Next, for Grand Theft Auto 5, I locked it at 60 frames per second and I left it down at 720p. 1080p just couldn't quite get there. But as you can see, it's running super smooth, and honestly, this game looks pretty good at 720p anyway. I've never really played this game, but just testing it out right here was actually a lot of fun, so I might spend some more time with this in the future. Now, one game I did spend a lot of time with back in the day was BioShock Infinite, and this one at 1080p and low settings is just gorgeous. I'm not really sure this game has aged that well in terms of just the overall gameplay, but I really like the story of this one, and the graphics just can't be beat even today. And yes, as you can see, a very stable 60 frames per second, this one is great. Moving forward to Doom Eternal, this one didn't do so well at 1080p, so I did drop it to 720p with low settings. And the gameplay was nice and smooth, but it did not get a very high frame rate. You could look at an average about 35 frames per second. So honestly, when it comes to Doom Eternal, this is probably not the best way to play it. But I think it gives you a good indication of what to expect with similar titles. Typically what I found is that most games would play just fine at 720p, but if you did bump it up to 1080p, you were going to see some drops in frame rate. And sometimes with more of the modern games, it comes down to optimizations and how well they're going to work with low-powered systems. There are going to be some more recent games like Resident Evil 3 which will play at 1080p and they look spectacular. But for these, I would recommend seeing if they do have FSR available, like this one for example does, and so I have it on balanced settings. And I also capped the frame rate to 30 frames per second just to give me a smooth gameplay experience. So I would say in the end, this is a pretty capable gaming PC, especially considering that we don't have a graphics card inside. It can likely play some of the more modern AAA games, but I would expect to use a 720p resolution and low settings. Either way, for 550 bucks, this is pretty impressive. Now let's move over to game emulation, because I think it shines even more in this regard. We're not going to mess with the lower end stuff, we're just going to do GameCube and above, and off the bat I just set everything to 1080p and moved on from there. And as expected, most of those middle tier games, something like Time Splitters 2, 1080p no problem. But I was amazed to find that the high end games for GameCube also did 1080p without a hitch. Usually these games will have some sort of stuttering at some point, but I wasn't seeing any of that at all, especially with F-Zero GX. This was running smooth as butter. In fact, it was running so well that it got me thinking, let's see if we can actually bump this up even higher than 1080p. I typically will cap it out there, but it just felt like it could do more. So I'm going to enable a widescreen hack, and then I'm going to move it up from a 3x resolution of 1080p all the way up to a 6x resolution. That resolution is somewhere between 4K and 5K, and while the display is not going to be capable of showing that much fidelity, the computer is still running. And so what this means is that you can play this not only as a 1080p GameCube machine, but you can likely play it in 4K with most games as well. And to me, this amount of emulation power with something so small is super impressive. So moving over to Nintendo Wii, we're going to use Kirby's Epic Yarn. Surprisingly, this game usually has a lot of slowdown, but as you can see here, even at 1080p 3x resolution, it's running great. So this gives me confidence that most Nintendo Wii games are going to be just fine. Next, we'll do the Metroid Prime trilogy, which is also a Nintendo Wii game, but we're going to use the Prime Hack version of Dolphin, which is going to give us dual analog controls. And I did get a hiccup every once in a while with this, but it was when a new shader was caching. So this is one of those times where the more you play it, the better the gameplay is going to be. Okay, popping over to the studio here, we're going to do some PS2 gameplay. This is also at 1080p, so a 3x resolution. And I kind of screwed up the exposure settings on my camera when I was setting this up, so if the colors look a little bit washed out, that is my camera, has nothing to do with the mini PC or my monitor. And as you can see, 60 frames per second solid across the board at 1080p, even with God of War 2. The only game I played that had to be downscaled was Champions of Norrath down to 720p. But to be fair, this first part of the game is almost impossible to render correctly. The fact that we're getting 60 frames per second at 720p is actually kind of amazing. So yes, PS2 is awesome on the UM580. Okay, moving over to original Xbox, we're running this at a 2x resolution, and I picked this stage in particular with Dead or Alive 3 because the mirroring on the floor makes it really hard to render. Even so, with a 2x resolution, we're getting very close to 60 frames per second the whole time. It is dipping down every once in a while, which does cause a little bit of slowdown, but I would still say this is playable. I had similar success with Halo Combat Evolved. This would mostly be 60 frames per second, but every once in a while it would dip down. But even then, I did not find it actually distracting from my gameplay. I had a lot of fun. So these two games working great. But unfortunately, I found others that just didn't work well at all. Soul Calibur 2 is a great example. Even bumping it down to a native resolution, it was running at about 20 frames per second. I had similar success with Halo 2. This one was getting about 30 frames per second. It was very sluggish and kind of jittery feeling. So when it comes to Xbox, some games play great and others don't. And so I would definitely not say this is a system to buy specifically for original Xbox emulation. Next up, we're going to try Nintendo 3DS. For this one, I did a 4x resolution, and as you can see, it's playing just fine. Now, at a 5x resolution, I was getting some slowdown, so this is probably going to be the upper limit right here, but man, it actually looks really great even at 4x. Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds is probably one of the harder games for me to get good success with when it comes to emulation on Citra, and so I was amazed to find that it was doing so well at a 4x resolution here. This is honestly one of the best 3DS emulating machines that I've tested before. Okay, let's go back to home console systems, this time with Nintendo Wii U. Now for this one, I just played everything at the native resolution, but honestly, I probably could have gone into the graphics pack and upscaled a lot of these to 1080p as well. Natively, most of these games will run at 720p, with a few others like Wind Waker HD that'll play at 1080p. Either way, yes, Wii U was excellent on this machine, absolutely no issues whatsoever. Now, of course, every time I have to test Breath of the Wild, and for this one in particular, I actually locked it at 45 frames per second. There were times where I could get it to above that, like say around 50 frames per second, but I found that the most smooth experience was at 45, and it looked great too. So yes, this is going to be excellent for Nintendo Wii U, including Breath of the Wild. Next, we have Nintendo Switch, so I'm going to play most of these in handheld mode, and then a couple others when necessary I put them over into docked mode. But as you can see, Mario Kart 8 is running just fine, same thing with Super Mario Bros. 3D World. I also tried out Bowser's Fury, and this one did really well too. So yeah, I would say for most of the medium 3D titles, they should play at full speed. I even got Link's Awakening to run at 60 frames per second. One note here is that I had been using the wrong version of this game for some of my previous videos. It turns out you're not supposed to use the most updated version of this game, which is version 1.0.1. Instead, you're supposed to use version 1.0.0 because the 60 frames per second patch will work best with that one. And so yes, sure enough, with Link's Awakening, if you use that specific game file, it'll work better. In fact, I could even get the Steam Deck to run at full speed using that version as well. Either way, in general, I would say that most Nintendo Switch games are going to be emulatable on the UM580. Something like Mario Odyssey is a great example here. This one has to be used in dock mode when using the Vulkan back end, or else you'll get some really weird graphical glitches. But even then, this one is mostly smooth. It is going to compile shaders here and there, so you will get some stutters, but overall I would say it's a fully playable experience. Alright, so last system we're going to test here is going to be PS3. I'm going to keep all of these at a native resolution as well, and we'll just kind of go through the gamut. As you can see, Dead or Alive 5 works just great, same thing with Demon's Souls. For each of these games, I had no hint of slowdown whatsoever. I was also surprised to find that some of the more heavy-hitting games, like DMC, was still playing at a relatively stable 30 frames per second. So I would also consider this one to be fully playable. Now, Wipeout HD did not stay at a full 60 frames per second the entire time, but honestly, this one I've actually never seen at a stable 60 frames per second, even with computers that have dedicated graphics cards. So really, this might be the best you can expect for this game in particular. It's kind of the similar story with 3D games like Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. This one also couldn't stay at 60 frames the entire time, but the gameplay still was relatively smooth. I was getting an average of about 50 frames per second, and to me that was just great. So yeah, I would say a lot of PS3 is also going to be playable on this device, to my surprise. Now I know I've been praising this thing left and right, but there is one wet blanket I need to throw on it. And that is, I was not able to get Batocera to function properly on this machine. If you remember, we installed that SSD into the machine itself. That one would not boot. I also tried various flash drives with various versions of Batocera. None of them could get past that first video loading screen. And so unfortunately, even after spending several hours troubleshooting it here, I could not get Batocera to launch. And to me, that's kind of a bummer because I would have loved to have put a dedicated hard drive inside the machine with Batocera inside, and then I could have used that in tandem with the mini PC itself that is going to be running like Windows PC games or productivity. Either way, yeah, unfortunately, Batocera is not working. Okay, so now that we've looked through what the UM580 can do, let's summarize things and say what I like and what I don't like about the machine. So let's start with what I like. Number one, I love the compact size of this little computer. This one is a true mini PC. I also like the fact that it has a very small power brick and is also capable of alt mode. This turns a mini PC, which is already very compact, into something that's even more portable because you're not having to drag around another big power supply. I like the fact that this thing is upgradable across the board. Not only can you buy it in bare bones mode so you can put your own components inside, but it also even has space for a 2.5-inch drive as well. As we saw, the PC gaming performance on this was pretty dang good. I wouldn't go as far as to call this a gaming PC, but man, it can play a lot of games on this PC. But I think where it really shines is in emulation. This thing punched above its weight class in every single category when it came to emulation in particular. Specifically, I was amazed at how well it did when it came to GameCube and PS2 at very high resolutions. And finally, in kind of combination with the whole compact size thing, this device just kind of stays out of sight and out of mind. Not only does it not take up a lot of space on your desk, but it also runs very quiet. And if you were to take advantage of the VESA mount option, you could put it behind a monitor and you wouldn't notice it at all. Now let's talk about a couple of things I don't like about the device. Number one, I kind of don't like that it doesn't have a USB-A port on the front. There were a lot of times where I had to reach around behind the mini PC to plug in a controller or a keyboard or things like that. And so I think I would rather have had a USB-C and a USB-A on the front and then move that other USB-C to the back. But probably my biggest disappointment was the lack of Batocera. I was not able to get it booting on this PC. At first I thought it might have been the motherboard, but the UM560 was able to boot Batocera, so there's something else going on here, and I'm not really sure what it is. And finally, as much as I like the idea of alt mode, I think it's a little bit limited just based on the amount of power delivery that most monitors can give. And so yes, while it's a feature that's available, I think you may be waiting on a monitor that can power the device more than anything else. Either way, I'm a fan of the function, I just don't know how practical practical it's actually going to be. Now, the other day when I was working on this video, I realized that I have made a lot of mini PC videos here on this channel. I think we're up to about 18 right now, and I also have like 2 or 3 more in the works. And so I sat down and made this spreadsheet that you can see here, and I'll have it linked in the video description. Here, I've sorted all the PCs that I have tested by price from low to high, and then I also put a rating in here for how it performs in various categories, things like retro emulation, or Xbox, or Batocera, or PC games. And so if you're in the market for a mini PC, the way I thought about it is that you kind of think about your budget and then what you want to play out of it, and then kind of use that price column versus all the different performance that you can see here to find the best fit for you. Obviously, there are way more mini PCs in the world than the 18 that I have reviewed, but this should give you a good indication of what to expect. Also, within each of the major price categories, I've added what I call a top pick. So if you're looking for something under $300, I have one there, and then one under $500, then one a little bit around the $500 mark, which is this UM580. And then of course the B550 at the high end of the mark also does really well, but it is $700. Anyway, like I said, I'll leave this linked in the video description, and I'll update this as I make more videos as well. And I'm thinking about making a dedicated video that just talks about in general what to expect at the different price points and what my recommendations are. So let me know in the comments below if you think that's something you would be interested in watching. Anyway, that's about it for this video here. I'm really excited about the UM580 because I feel like mini PCs have grown so much in the past couple of years. I feel like the mini PC market really got started once all these graphics cards got really expensive, but it is super awesome to see how far they've come in just a couple years. Here we have a device at $550 that can emulate just about anything under the sun, and it also has a great form factor and is ultra portable. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below about the UM580. And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.